What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome to this week's live stream. This is episode 6, according to my notes, which I guess that sounds right. And I don't have anything really big to talk about today, but I do have a couple of things I do want to talk about, and I want to start that off by talking about Lightroom Classic 10.1. So, I don't know what Adobe did. I really it is so frustrating to me to use this. So I have uh, reverted from 10.1 to 10.0 twice. First, when they released 10.1, which was a horrible, buggy, crashy, terrible mess, went back to 10.0. Then they released 10.1.1, which fixed some things, but obviously Adobe's concern was mostly fixing a Creative Cloud syncing issue and not actually fixing the software. So I thought after I had did that and I did a clean install, so completely removed Lightroom Classic, rebooted my computer, completely reinstalled it from scratch or square one or whatever you want to say, uh, and just it's a mess. I don't know what's going on, so I'm back running 10.0. I'm really hoping 10.2 actually fixes the problems. And it's not like the Adobe support forums and stuff aren't littered with people complaining about problems. And I would join that collection of people complaining about problems and talking to Adobe, except I have so many problems I don't even know where to start. First of all, 10.1 absolutely hammers my hard drives. I've got Samsung 970 EVO solid state drives, and I have never seen a version of Lightroom before where starting Lightroom up or just just starting Lightroom up and my disk access light is solid on for several minutes, or at least a minute. And it hammers the drive. Now, I don't really care that much about that. I mean, when push comes to shove, it's doing some stuff on the disk, whatever, big deal. You know, it's not going to wear out my solid state drive in 2, 3 uses. It's not that big of a deal. However, it seems like it's firing off so much disk I/O and disk access stuff that I'm running into problems with Lightroom becoming unresponsive. So in Windows, it says the screen, the window border grays out. I'm running this on Windows 10 Pro, by the way. My workstation is an Intel i7 8700K with 32 gig of RAM. So it's not like a junky old laptop computer. This is a pretty hefty desktop. So constantly goes unresponsive. That 10.1 was worse for me. It would go unresponsive like every time I tried to do something. And I have a friend who is running into the same problem. He has a little bit lower, well, substantially lower spec computer in many respects. It's a 2500K with 16 gig of RAM, but 9 worked fine for him. 10 worked okay. 10.1, which he has to use because he has a Nikon Z6 II, and that's the first version that supported the Z6 II file format. 10.1 for him goes unresponsive constantly. And I thought I had gotten past that and that I wasn't seeing that problem anymore. And then today I started trying to do something and I started seeing these unresponsive things. The other problem, and perhaps the bigger problem, if you will, is on my machine, Lightroom is absolutely breaking something in Windows. And I don't know what it is. I have no idea how to track it down. I'm not really interested in trying to track it down at this point. I'm just so frustrated with this. But I tried to I exported an image today, and this is what prompted me to downgrade to 10.0. I exported an image, and when I went to open up the file Explorer, Windows Explorer, whatever the heck they call it now in Windows 10, my computer with the drives and all of that stuff, I would get the window, it would draw, and then the computer just would not, could not find drives. It just would hang. It just sat there, and I had to restart my computer, or have to restart my computer to get that to respond properly. In 10.1, when it was first released and I first upgraded to it, I had that problem after I imported pictures. I had that problem after I exported pictures. I had that problem if I tried to sync something, sync a published folder, published collection. Like, I'd had the problem everywhere. And 10.1 seemed to sort of help, but obviously it didn't fix whatever was causing the problem, because I'm still having the problem, and it's absolutely ridiculous that whatever Adobe's doing is causing essentially Windows File Manager to no longer be able to access the hard drive or network or whatever it is that it's interfering with after it's been run or it's been used. And so basically, with Lightroom 10.1 and 10.1.1, my workflow, when I wasn't getting ready to throw something at my monitor because it was broken and constantly hanging in the software, my workflow was literally do whatever I was going to do in Lightroom, quit out of Lightroom, and reboot my computer so that I had a working computer. And this is absolutely unacceptable. This was one of my greatest fears in some respects of Adobe going to a subscription software. Now, they're having huge problems with Mac OS. They're having huge problems with Mac OS Big Sur. They're having huge problems with Apple's M1 Silicon. And obviously they're having problems with Windows, and I don't know if people aren't reporting it, or it's, I don't quite know what the situation sort of is specifically, because there's so many problems kind of going on right now with Lightroom on Lightroom 10.1 and 10.0, but for whatever reason, my problems show up predominantly in 10.1, and 10.0 seems to make things work fine. And true to form, and I know there are people in the community, they're trying to help, they're not paid Adobe support people, but one of the things that I always find so utterly frustrating about community support forums is the absolute kind of nonsensical help. Just deal with it. Hoop jumping through absolutely ridiculous piles of just hoop upon hoop upon hoop. Try reformatting your computer. Like, I shouldn't have to reformat my computer to fix some company's broken software that's running on it, and I'm not going to. That's just ridiculous. So Adobe, you guys got to get your crap together and fix Lightroom. Hopefully 10.2 will be out in the next couple of weeks, I hope. And hopefully 10.2 will support or will work properly, and that Adobe didn't just spend the last 2 months that they have had 10.1 out trying to find some snazzy new feature to add is a priority over actually having fast, stable software. Because this is ridiculous. And like I said, I don't even know where to begin to start to come up with diagnostic information to be able to feed to Adobe, or whatever, to even start to begin to track down where the issue is. And quite honestly, basically everybody I personally know that's running Lightroom is either, one, very angry and putting up with the crap because they have cameras that aren't supported in 10.0 and therefore they can't downgrade, or they've downgraded to 10.0. And that's not a really wonderful position to be operating in. So yeah, like I said, I'm not happy right now as far as Lightroom goes. Software's, I mean, from a functionality standpoint, I'm fine with the software, but from a you know, like feature set thing, but from a performance and stability thing, just not thrilled. So, point two on my list of talking points is something it's an observation I just had around sound. So 2 weeks ago, I think it was, I said I was working on a set of videos that was going to be talking about everything I knew about audio. I was doing this in response to some questions I had gotten on my F6 thing, and I wanted to work through, and I kind of tried to do a live stream on it, which is the missing live stream that I ended up deleting because it just didn't work very well. And so I had kind of, I had there was a bunch of things I wanted to talk and work through. And so I started writing a script. And as I was writing the script, things expanded and it went from like one 30-minute episode to two 30-minute episodes to three 40-minute episodes. And in the process, I realized there's things in there that I'd like to talk about that really don't make sense talking about in a specific video to sound. And then I realized, well, wait a minute, the live stream is a great place to sort of throw out an idea about something like this, to throw out an idea that I'm sort of chewing on that, you know, maybe doesn't need to be or belong in a video. And so one of the things that's always sort of tripped me up or confused me or messed with my head when it came to sound is why so much of the audio world seems so much more crazy to me than the photography world. And okay, audiophiles aren't professional sound recordists, recording engineers, etc. And it's not necessarily fair to lump professional audio people into the same category as like audiophiles who are buying $15,000 Magic Fairy pixie dust coated power cables that don't have any actual value. You know, they don't do anything. It's just wires that are being sold to them for a huge amount of money. And I realized, or what I started sort of chewing on is, I think where all of this comes from in some respects is time. Uh, Photography kind of does the inverse of time. It takes a moment in time and fixes it forever, more or less. You're looking at when you're looking at a print, you're looking at a moment in time. And actually there's a couple of thoughts here too. So one is time, and I'll come back to that in a second. The other one is when you're looking at a picture, you're looking at I don't know what a good word of it is, but you're looking at the thing you're looking at, if that makes any sense. You're not looking at, I mean, you're looking at a representation of the real world, but you aren't looking at something that you need to try and interpret to mean what it is that you're looking at. So if you're looking at a picture of an eagle, it's a picture of an eagle, and you know, you can look at it very closely and see things like contrast and resolution and color and blah blah blah. You know, if you're looking at a test chart, it's a picture of a test chart. You can see how that test chart, you know, reads, what the resolution of the camera and lens was, or so on and so forth. And versus with audio, everything happens in the time domain. It's sound, tone, pitch, frequency is time domain based. It's a something per second. It doesn't exist without time. A instantaneous impulse of sound is an instantaneous impulse of sound. It's not a note or a tone or something like that. And then even as you take things from that sort of micro level to the macro level of an entire conversation, this video, a song, anything that you're listening to for information, you have an even bigger time component. So you're listening to me speak, for example, and your brain has to temporarily store and process the sound that I'm making over time. And that's really kind of like hard. Well, I mean, it's not hard, like physically hard, but there's a dependence on memory that just isn't really there in terms that, in photography. In photography, you can very easily sort of compare those two first order representations. You can look at the test charts side by side and compare them with very little influence of perception. I mean, not this, and this isn't to say that there isn't a matter of an influence or perception or a perception factor going into photography. There absolutely is, but it's compared to what I see in audio. It's more muted. It's more subdued. So, you know, but going like so flipping that around to audio, you everything you like, you can listen to a song and then listen to another song and compare them, but what you're really comparing is your memory of the first song to the sort of very short-term memory of the second song, regardless of sort of how close you or quickly you kind of switch back and forth between them. And like I said, the other thing is obviously is that what you look at when you're looking at audio information on a computer or in in your DAW or whatever, is you're either looking at a waveform or you're looking at a spectrograph. And because generally I don't know of anybody who or what else you would be looking at. That's certainly the only thing I've ever seen or ever used. Neither of which are inherently useful in telling you what you actually would have been listening to. So whereas a picture is the picture, and a picture, yes, it's a representation of the thing in the real world, a waveform or a spectrograph isn't even that connected to what it is that it's representing. You're looking at squiggly lines and you can't really tell if the squiggly line that you're looking at is the word "the" or the word "and" or something else, or whatever. And so the sort of hypothesis that I've been building in my head on this is, because of this time dependence that audio has, it's way more influenced by perception. It's way more influenced by, your emotions, anything that's going on, than a photograph or a movie. And again, like I said, it's not to say that perception isn't something that is a factor in photography or videography. For example, like I print on matte paper because I feel that in handling prints, and oh yes, I know there are tons of photographers who are like, you never handle your prints, that's sacrilege, it destroys them, blah blah blah. I handle my prints. They're artifacts that I want to feel and touch, and it's part of the reason that I make prints the size that I make, is so that I can feel and touch them and pick them up and show them to people and people can hold them. But I print on matte paper because I used to print on gloss, and gloss paper is better capable of reproducing detail. It's more capable of having more saturated blacks and having therefore better dynamic range, but it just feels cheap to me. Even though I didn't use cheap gloss paper, it feels like the kind of thing that you get from a drugstore or whatever, versus matte paper where it actually feels like art. So there's absolutely a perception component in photography, but it's far different from the perception component I find is in sound and in audio. For example, watching microphone reviews, I see plenty of people, and there's a guy on YouTube, Curtis Judd. He makes really good, I've really started really like his reviews of audio equipment among other things that he reviews. And the premise, generally speaking, and this isn't just him, I see this kind of across the board with audio stuff, is you make a bunch of recordings in the same environment, usually simultaneously with a bunch of different microphones, and you listen to them and you choose the microphone that sounds best to you. Certainly in the audiophile world, or the more sane part of the audiophile world, you do double-blind tests and double-blind ABX tests, and to determine whether you can hear a difference between headphones or speakers or whatever, cables or amplifiers, etc. And like I said, I look at this kind of coming from the photography world, where mostly nobody that I know of does double-blind tests of anything related to their camera or their photography. It's, you do a test, you make a measurement, and the measurement stands. You know, like, obviously we might argue sample to sample variation for, like, well, you got a good copy of a lens, and we know sample to sample variation exists in camera gear. Lens Rentals has done phenomenal testing using their entire fleet of various lenses. And in fact, it's one of the reasons I think Lens Rentals tests of lenses are easily the most relevant and useful tests of lenses, because they test 20 or 30 or 50 copies, not one copy that could be a really good sample or a really bad sample. And they find substantial variation from lens to lens. And so, you know, it's not like we won't in photography argue, well, that was a bad copy of the lens, or, you know, something like that, or, you know, that kind of thing. But, like, I never see somebody who argues, if you put the numbers in front of them, this is the dynamic range we've measured from this camera using this methodology, or this is the resolution that we've measured on this lens using this methodology or this set of lenses. It's hard, I'm hard pressed to find people who argue that flat out that's wrong. You know, sometimes you see it, but more often than not, when you see it, it's somebody who doesn't really understand what they're arguing in the first place. You know, it's not a professional photographer arguing that the lens is the, you know, the resolution, that they can see millions of times more resolution out of a lens than the lens can actually deliver. Yet you see this all the time in audio stuff. And like I said, it's always perplexed me why there was this great sort of mysticism. I've said this in many of my audio videos, that I feel like the audio world, there's a huge amount of mysticism. And like I said, I'm starting to think that some of that mysticism, or a lot of that mysticism, comes down to the fact that more often than not, perception is the only tool that's being used to evaluate something. Which mic sounds good? When you're doing your processing in your DAW or whatever, what filters sound good? How does compression on this make it sound? Does that sound better or worse? Evaluating speakers and headphones, which ones sound better? As opposed to actual numbers and performance specifications. We tested this. It's got 15 stops of dynamic range or whatever, therefore X. Like, I don't really see that much. And I think that that has to come back to, or I think it comes back to, the fact that sound depends on time. Therefore, it depends more on our short-term memory and our brain processing things. And therefore, it's more open to influence when our brain is messing around with it. If you're in a good mood, you listen to something, it sounds better than if you're pissed off at it. If you're pissed off at the, you know, speakers or whatever, or you're having problems in general, you're more apt to find a bigger influence from perception in that. or as I said, at least I think that's the hypothesis I'm running on. I don't have anything to back this up, any scientific testing or anything like that. It's just a thought, which is why I'm talking about it here instead of talking about it in a proper video or a more specific video. And following on that line of talking about perception in sound, I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of limits in photography. So I had a question asked a couple days ago, a day ago, something like that, on my website about lenses and camera selection and the EOS R5 and, you know, a hypothetical, well, not hypothetical, the expected eventually R5S or whatever Canon ends up calling it, and megapixel, you know, how much resolution and whose lenses are better and whatnot, and the other thing. And that brought me back to a number of thoughts that I've been having on photography in the era of super high resolution cameras. And I don't want to say that people are wrong for thinking, or I don't want to say people are wrong, but I see this kind of continued expectation from people about resolution in cameras, and there's kind of this, it seems to me, I should say, that there's this idea of, well, I've got a 45 megapixel camera, so I always get a 45 megapixel image. And it's true, yes, the file that comes out of your camera is 45 megapixels or has 45 million pixels worth of information. But there's a difference. One of the things that I've realized more and more in the last few years is there's a difference between having resolution in the sensor and having effective resolution out of the camera. And, you know, as we get to these higher and higher resolution sensors, we I see where we keep running into sort of problems. So if you read reviews from the digital picture, number of, you know, reviewers like that, I think even DP Review will talk about this to a certain extent, but they don't, I don't ever remember them really getting into it. So, but like Brian at the Digital Picture, he'll talk about diffraction limited apertures. It's the point at which the blur spot created by diffraction, which is an inherent thing in a lens, and it's an inherent property of light, and it's an inherent property in physics, and there's an extent that you can computationally deal with it. So Canon has diffraction correction algorithms in DP Review and even built into their cameras. And because they know the convolution function or whatever it is for the diffraction for each of their specific lenses at specific apertures, they can do stuff to minimize it. And even if you're not using a Canon camera, you can do stuff to, or a Canon, the Canon software. And I'm not even sure what the state of it is for, like, say, Sony and Nikon or whatever, but I would hope that they've got similar kinds of things going on. But even if you're not using Canon software for their cameras, you can do some things to mitigate diffraction by adjusting, say, your sharpening settings and changing how you sharpen things. Because effectively what it is it's softening things, and you can sort of recover some of it by sharpening differently. It's not quite that simple. And the simple fact of the matter is, and I played with this when Canon first announced their diffraction correction, is I was very impressed by how capable it was at sort of reversing the effects of diffraction softening. But anyway, as we talk about higher and higher resolution cameras, we talk about lower and lower diffraction limiting apertures. So the 45 megapixel R5 or D850 or Z7 Mark II or what have you, is diffraction limited somewhere around, I think it's f7.1 or f8. I think I'm going off of memory here. Which basically, like, if you've been around photography long enough, you know that as you stop a lens down, what tends to happen is the picture gets sharper, and then it gets to a point where it stops getting sharper, and then it starts getting softer. Well, that softer part is diffraction softening your image. That's the impact of diffraction. And the consequence of, obviously, one of the consequences of having these higher resolution sensors is we need to have lenses that are, well, you could say faster would help, because a faster lens you can stop down before you get to the diffraction thing. But we generally just need lenses that are maximally sharp, wide open, which is a demand on lens design, which is a cost center in lens design. And this is, like, I tell people, as resolution increases, there's diminishing returns and increasing costs. And this is one of those costs. A higher resolution sensor is more demanding of your lenses because, among other things, but in part because diffraction impacts your image faster. So you have less aperture range before that softening impacts your image at a pixel level. Of course, the other way to think about this is that your camera and lens's effective resolution is not going to be what the sensor resolution is. And there's a lot of places, I think, where this kind of steps up. And for example, I tend to call this the photographic coffin corner. And I see a lot of places where increasing in technology, increasing resolution in cameras pushes photographers tighter into this photographic coffin corner. So diffraction with high resolution sensors is one of those places. You can't stop down without losing, while still getting the megapixels of your sensor. And this is actually, you could make an argument as this is why, well, this is part of why I say there's diminishing returns on higher and higher resolution sensors. You get to a 90 megapixel sensor and you're going to be diffraction limited somewhere around, I think, f2.8 or f4. And so if you're shooting, say, landscapes with that, your 90 megapixel sensor, at f11 or f16, your 90 megapixel sensor will never deliver 90 effective megapixels worth of image detail because of diffraction. So, as I started to say, I started really seeing this whole photographic coffin corner thing when I was shooting with a 600 f4 in Yellowstone on my 30 megapixel 5D Mark IVs. And the realization I had was, because of the 30 megapixels, the sort of resolution limit or resolution, if I wanted pixel sharp images, so I wanted to be able, I don't know why I'm explaining it, goes without saying, if I wanted pixel sharp images, I had to shoot with a shutter speed of in excess of 1,000th of a second, which on a camera whose fastest shutter speed is 1/8,000th of a second, that's a little over 2 stops. I think it's 2 2/3 stops worth of shutter speed range. Of course, shooting at that high of a shutter speed means that you don't get an awful lot of light. So you either have to shoot at f4, which I found problematic in many cases, because I would be shooting at f4 and I just wouldn't have the depth of field to get what I wanted in focus. I much rather would have been shooting at 5, 6, or 8. And in some respects, this is one of those places where I realized that, a 605/6 wouldn't actually be a bad lens for me. I don't want a 611. That's way too slow, I think. For me, it's way too slow. But like a 600 f4 is an awful lot of weight for a lens that I almost always want to shoot stopped down to have enough depth of field to get what I'm trying to shoot, all of what I'm trying to shoot in focus, and have, more flexibility with that. But anyway, because I was shooting at such a high shutter speed, and it's not just camera shake that is a factor. Subject movement is a factor. And the finer the pixel pitch, so the higher the resolution the sensor, the more pixels the subject covers in the same amount of time, which makes the image, you have subject motion blur at a pixel level that becomes obvious and visible if you're not increasing your shutter speed to compensate. So what worked on a 20 megapixel camera for, a grazing animal or something like that, you have to step up your shutter speed if you want, again, if you want to keep pixel sharp images, you have to step up your shutter speed, because where the subject motion would have only been on 1 pixel in the 20 megapixel camera, on the 30 megapixel camera, it's 1.5 pixels or 2 pixels or something to that effect. So what I found, of course, is that I needed to shoot at high shutter speeds to keep everything sharp. That was either pushing me to shoot at really wide apertures, which was hindering my ability to get what I wanted in focus, so I was stopping down. And then, so the only compensation that you have left as a photographer for that is upping the ISO. And this becomes doubly problematic if you're shooting under a tree canopy, or shooting something in a tree canopy, or shooting something in an overcast situation. And so you go, well, okay, I can shoot, our cameras today are fantastic. And, if you went back and talked to film photographers in the 90s and said, oh yeah, I can shoot at ISO 10,000 or 12,800, and I can make A3 plus or 16 by 20 prints, and they look phenomenal. They wouldn't even know what to think or say. I mean, that's so far beyond the capabilities of 35 millimeter film, or film just in general, that I don't think a lot of photographers these days, as people keep pushing for these higher and higher ISO and better ISOs and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, don't get me wrong, this isn't to say that, like, I wouldn't love to have even better high ISO performance, but as people keep asking, or asking, I'm not going to say demanding, asking for this, it's like we forget how incredible our cameras are in terms of being able to do stuff like this. Like, I would never, like, ISO 400 or ASA 400 film was a grainy mess. And like, that was about as high when I shot film as you really wanted to shoot film if you couldn't, avoid it, or you weren't shooting for a newspaper. And I routinely now shoot like ISO 800, ISO 1600, 3264. I've got prints from stuff at 12,800. If the subject's compelling enough, it's not that hard to not make it work. So again, going back to, like you said, you have high shutter speeds. Now, obviously, if you're shooting with non-super telephoto lenses, you have more room, but high shutter speeds, apertures, now, of course, stopping down to f8 on, say, an R5, and you're already starting to run into those diffraction limits. You're definitely into the diffraction limits if you're stopping down to f8 on a Sony a7R4 at 60 megapixels, and you'll be way into diffraction limits on a 90 megapixel, hypothetical Canon 5DS or 5RS or R5S or whatever, anyway, whatever they call it. Uh, but then to get a usable exposure out of all of that, you're cranking the ISO up. And I did tests a while back where I was looking at sort of the effective resolving or resolution performance, the effective resolution of, I've done it for the 5D Mark III, the EOS M5, and the 5D Mark IV, looking at the effective resolution of those cameras versus ISO. And basically what I found is that by the time I was shooting at ISO 6400 on a 5D Mark IV, the effective resolution that I had was somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 megapixels, plus or minus a bit. The noise just decimates the information that would have been there if you were shooting at a lower ISO. Now, like I said, I've made prints from images at 12,800, which is well below a 12 megapixel effective resolution, and they look fine, which actually should tell you an awful lot about just how much information in a print you really need to make a print, and how important resolution is in making that print. But you're not, and this is also something that you can't really just undo this with better noise reduction software. There's an extent where noise reduction techniques can be used and can help, especially if you're doing something like stacking, median stacking or mean stacking, or one of those options. However, the reason that that helps so much is you're actually getting more signal, which allows the noise to be averaged out, and not just it's not just a single exposure thing. And in a single exposure thing, there really is a limit to what noise reduction software can do to back down, back up, and recover the stuff that's in the picture that's being masked by noise. But anyway, so it's like, when I was talking to this guy or responding to this guy on my blog or my website, he's talking about, like, wanting to go to a 90 megapixel camera, and I'm finding myself going, like, I don't quite know what that really buys. I mean, it certainly buys a number on the box. And to a real extent, I'm not even going to argue that there's a problem with this, at least not the camera part. Like I've said this before when I was talking about, when I was talking about 20 frames per second with the R5, and when I was talking about 30 frames a second with the Sony Alpha 1, the camera manufacturers, and I think I did a video last year talking about the camera industry evolving or advancing technology and innovation in the camera industry. And while I might argue that the camera industry hasn't been tremendously innovative, what we really get is a lot of iterations on sort of the same thing, improvements, but it's an iterative approach to improving. Where I'm really starting to see a problem is the software post-processing side of things on the computer. So software like Lightroom, and there's really nothing else out there as far as I'm concerned that has the digital asset management side of shooting and managing your photos the way Lightroom does. But then Lightroom really doesn't provide tools to, well, so first of all, Lightroom's still stuck in, and this is true of pretty much everything. It's not just Lightroom, it's Capture One, it's Canon Digital Photo Professional, it's Darkroom, it's all software out there across the board for photography. They're all still very much stuck in the pixels equal pixels thought process. And there's some utility in that. There's some truth still in the pixels equal pixels, screen pixels, things that happen at the pixel level, etc. But I think what we really are going to need to start seeing in on the software side of things is a shift to software that works more abstractly. Because when you start talking about the impact of noise on image resolution, you aren't working, when you're working with a noisy image, you aren't working with, it may be a 40 megapixel, 50 megapixel source file, but it isn't a 50 megapixel an effective 50 megapixel image. It's got a lower resolution because of details, in terms of detail, because of the noise. And the same thing goes with diffraction. So there comes to be a point. Now, obviously, like I said, diffraction, sophisticated algorithms, and knowing the way lenses, specific lenses work, diffraction can be computationally removed from images to an extent. But we need to sort of start moving away from the idea that, like in Lightroom, sharpening, it's so many pixels of radius, so much strength. And that works when the detail is at the pixel level, but when you start getting to where the detail is 2 or 3 pixels and everything else is noise, that sharpening algorithm would work way better if it was processing at the detail is are 3 pixels and noise is, the pixel scale. Likewise, in talking about high frame rates, the problem that I keep coming back to is that they create so much information for you to look at as a photographer that, yes, in some cases, the sports photographer, where there is only one image of the receiver, the ball touching the receiver's hand, it's easy to find the right picture. For anybody else who's shooting with the high frame rates, it becomes a very difficult process to start trying to narrow down hundreds of images, which on an EOS R5, I can generate 100 images in 5 seconds of continuous shooting. That's it. I mean, that's not a lot of continuous shooting. So if you're tracking a plane in an air show, or a cheetah running across the savannah or something like that, you have a tremendous amount of images coming like that. With the Sony Alpha 1 at 30 frames a second, it's a little over 3 seconds of shooting. And that is absolutely nothing, like time-wise. Like the amount of data that you have to sift through from, or you have, not that you have to, but you have to sift through from these cameras is kind of mind-boggling and staggering. And, as we continue to push boundaries and we continue to push higher resolution cameras and faster frame rates, and like, that's very much still the song and dance the camera companies are going after. And it's nice that, God, I remember in the 2010, late 2000s, early 2010s, and everybody was going on about the megapixel wars and megapixels, blah, blah, blah. And, people wanted, like, the Nikon D700 was so amazing because it was only 12 megapixels, and the 5D Mark II was a demonstration of Canon's cluelessness because at 21 megapixels, the pixels just weren't as good as the D5 or the D700s. Yet, generally speaking, the images from the 5D Mark II performed just as well, and often, in my opinion, looked better because the noise was finer grained than the images coming out of the D700. Great, not to slight the D700 in any way, but we've gotten past the idea, and I think it's great, that a few really good pixels are better than a lot of pretty good pixels. And that's really where the situation is, now is we have cameras like the 5D Mark IV, the A7R 3, 4, 5, 3 and 4, the Alpha 1, the Z7s, the D850s, even the the R5s. We have these cameras that have tons of resolution, and they have really good, all things considered, pixels at going on in the camera too. So it's great. What I'm trying to say is it's great that people have gotten past the idea that it's better to have only a few really good pixels, and that you get really good results, and often way better results, having a lot of good pixels versus a few good pixels. But on the same token, now we're starting to run into, we have so many good pixels that they're really only effectively usable at ISO 100 at the lowest ISO the camera supports, and kind of going on, and with a really good lens wide open, because stopping it down, you run into diffraction very quickly. There's still room, but that's going to go away as we get to higher and higher resolution cameras, and the numbers kind of go through the roof. Like 100 megapixels is, I want to say, diffraction limited at around, well, wait a minute, let me just look, because I have a calculator for this. So on a full frame camera, 100 megapixels is diffraction limited at f4.5. And if you go a stop faster, so 3.2, you're talking 200 megapixels. It doubles the resolution. But that doubling scaling kind of becomes really crazy, because you're talking 400 megapixels is diffraction limiting at f2.2. So, okay, there is an extent to where we're not going to anytime soon be so diffraction limited that our camera is just always diffraction limited. But an f4 lens, we are not far away from the point where an f4 lens is wide open, is diffraction limited on a camera. That's right around 100 megapixels on a full frame sensor. And like I said, we're not that far from that. So anyway, I've rambled again way longer than I had intended to rambling about stuff. If you found this video interesting, please smash that thumbs up button. Consider subscribing. If you are considering subscribing, I generally, aside from the live streams that I put up every Friday where I talk about camera stuff, my regular posting is kind of all over the place. I follow the schedule of live streams are scheduled, but I follow the premise of make good content, or make content that's as good as you can make it, and post when it's ready, as opposed to just post some random something something as fast as you can, because you have to beat the algorithm or whatever. So you're posting every 3 days or every week. A lot of what I'm working on, or what I work on, it takes me a longer time than I usually hope, like, or expect, and so I don't post tremendously regularly, again, other than these live streams. So if you are interested in subscribing, you may want to hit that notification bell so that you know when I post something, as opposed to just hoping that you happen upon it in your subscriptions or in your home feed or whatever. So as always, thank you if you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.